I've seen a lot of crime scenes, but nothing like the night I walked into apartment 4B. The victim, a wealthy architect named Julian, was dead in his armchair. The door was chained from the inside. The windows were painted shut. That's standard for a locked room mystery, right? But here is the paradox that kept me awake for years. Julian was wearing a heavy wool coat that was soaking wet, dripping water onto the dry floor. But outside, it hadn't rained in this city for 3 weeks. Pour yourself some tea. You're going to want to settle in for this. It was late October, the kind of night where the heat from the pavement just won't let go. Even after the sun drops, the air was thick, smelling of old exhaust and stale dust. My partner, Miller, was already at the door when I arrived, looking pale under the flickering yellow hallway light. "You need to see this, detective," he said. He didn't look at me. He was staring at his notebook like the answer was going to magically appear in the ink. I stepped inside. The apartment was expensive minimalist furniture, chrome lamps, dark wood floors. The silence was heavy, the kind that presses against your eardrums. In the center of the living room sat Julian. He looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping, except for the glass of whiskey spilled near his hand. And then, I saw the water. His dark grey coat was saturated, not just damp-soaked. A puddle had formed around his leather shoes, reflecting the neon sign from the bar across the street, that flashed pink and blue through the glass. I touched the sleeve. "Ice cold." "Miller?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "The windows. Sealed. Paint's 10 years old," he replied. "Door was chained. We had to kick it in." I looked up at the ceiling. Dry. No leaks. No sprinklers. Just smooth, white plaster. Stay with me until the end. The way this case twisted still surprises me today. I walked a slow circle around the body. The water wasn't just water. It had a faint, metallic smell, like copper, or maybe rusty pipes. I took out my flashlight and swept the floor. No footprints leading to the bathroom. No footprints leading to the kitchen. It was as if he had materialized in that chair, soaking wet, out of thin air. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It helps this channel reach more listeners. We found a receipt in his wet pocket. It was a mush of paper, but the ink was still legible. The Blue Note Jazz Club. Time stamped 8:45 p.m. That was 2 hours ago. The club was 10 blocks away. Even if he had walked, the streets were bone dry. Then came the first twist. I checked the thermometer on the wall. It read 78 degrees. But when I leaned in close to Julian's face, I saw it. His breath wasn't misting, obviously, but there were tiny, microscopic crystals of frost on his eyelashes. In a 78-degree room. "He didn't die here," I muttered. "But the door was chained from the inside," Miller argued. "I saw the chain snap myself. What would you have done in my place? Would you trust the physical evidence of the locked door, or the impossible state of the body?" I went to the kitchen. The sink was dry. The fridge hummed with a low, irritating buzz. I opened it. A carton of milk, some takeout. Normal. I closed it. Then, the second twist hit us. The phone on the side table rang. An old rotary landline. I picked it up with a handkerchief. "Is it done?" A woman's voice whispered. I didn't speak. "Julian, answer me. The tide is coming in," she said, and then the line went dead. The tide? We were 50 miles inland. There was no tide here. I looked back at the body. The puddle was spreading. It was creeping toward the rug, dark and silent. I realized then that my initial assumption that he had been drowned was wrong. There was no water in his lungs, I could tell by the lack of foam at the lips. He hadn't drowned. He had been frozen. But how does a frozen man end up in a locked, warm room without melting the moment he enters? The atmosphere in that room shifted. The shadows seemed to stretch. I felt eyes on me. Though the room was empty, the investigation didn't get easier. It got murkier, like looking through dirty glass. We identified the voice on the phone, Julian's business partner, Eleanor, a sharp woman, always dressed in silk, with eyes that assessed your net worth before she said hello. We brought her in. She sat in the interrogation room, the smoke from her cigarette curling up into the vent. Outside, the weather finally broke, and rain began to hammer against the precinct windows, streaking the glass with grime. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice steady. "We were working on a project, a new waterfront development. On the coast?" I asked. 50 miles away, yes. He was supposed to drive down there tonight. He never made it to his car, I said. He was found in his chair. Here's where it got complicated. We checked the security footage of his building. At 9 p.m., Julian walked into the lobby. He waved to the doorman. He was dry. He was wearing a light suit, no heavy wool coat. He got on the elevator alone. I watched that tape 10 times. The man on the screen was Julian. Same walk, same hair. But the man in the chair upstairs was wearing different clothes. "Miller," I said, rubbing my temples. "Did anyone else go up?" "Delivery guy. Pizza. 9:15 p.m. Left 5 minutes later." We tracked the delivery guy. Just a kid. Scared out of his mind. He swore he left the pizza at the door, heard footsteps inside, and left. He didn't see anyone. Then, a new danger appeared. I went back to the apartment alone the next night. I wanted to feel the room again. I was kneeling by the chair, looking at the floorboards where the water had dried, leaving a faint white stain. Salt. It was salt water. I heard a click. The sound of a lock tumbling. I spun around. The front door was still closed. The sound came from the wall. The shared wall with the next apartment. I pressed my ear against the plaster. Nothing. Just the faint sound of a television. What would you have done in my place? Would you have broken down the neighbor's door right then, without a warrant? I went out into the hallway and knocked on 4A. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. But I noticed something on the doormat. A single drop of water. I broke in. I didn't care about procedure anymore. The apartment was empty, stripped bare. But in the center of the living room was a large, industrial deep freezer. Unplugged. Lid open. It was empty, but it smelled of the sea, seaweed and brine. Suddenly, my phone rang. A known number. "You're getting too warm, detective," a male voice said. "Back off, or you'll slip." That was the third twist. The threat wasn't from Eleanor. It was a man's voice. I found a receipt behind the freezer. A purchase order for thermal insulation. Then, the fourth twist, and this one shook me. I got a call from the coroner. "Detective, you're not going to believe this," he said. "The body. It's thawing. And the fingerprints. They don't match the Julian on file." "What?" I gripped the phone. "It's his face. It's his twin," the coroner said. "Julian had a twin brother, Marcus. Disowned 20 years ago. The man in the chair wasn't Julian. It was Marcus. And Marcus had been dead for at least 6 hours before Julian walked into that lobby." I stood there in the empty apartment, the rain lashing the window. I realized I had been watching a magic trick. The Julian on the video was the real Julian. The dead man was the prop. If I kept going after this, there was no turning back. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The brother wasn't just a victim, he was the alibi. I drove to the coast. The rain was torrential now, turning the highway into a river of red taillights and glare. I needed to see the development site Eleanor had mentioned. When I arrived, the site was desolate. Skeleton frames of luxury condos rising out of the mud. The ocean roared nearby, black and angry. I found Julian's car parked near the pier. The hood was cold. I broke the window and searched the glove box. I found a diary. Not Julian's. Marcus. The entries were erratic. Marcus had been homeless, living on the docks. He wrote about the deal. Julian had offered him a way out, a warm place, money. All he had to do was sit in the chair. The motive wasn't passion. It was insurance fraud on a massive scale. Julian's business was failing. He needed to disappear, but he couldn't just vanish. He needed to be found dead. But the chain, the locked room. I drove back to the city, my mind racing. I went back to the apartment building. I didn't go to 4B. I went to the basement. The superintendent was there, a man named Griggs. He was sweating, packing a bag. Going somewhere? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He froze. Vacation. In the middle of a police investigation. I lit a cigarette, the smoke drifting between us. Tell me about the ventilation shafts, Griggs. He dropped the bag. I didn't kill him. I just installed the hook. The hook? On the inside of the door. With a fishing line. You pull it from the hallway, underneath the door frame, and it slides the chain into place. Then you pull the line free. It was an old trick. Simple. Mechanical. But it explained the locked door. Who paid you? I asked. Julian. He said it was a prank. A joke on his brother. A joke. I left him there for the uniforms to pick up. I knew where Julian was. He wasn't dead. He was waiting for the insurance payout to clear, so he could vanish to a non-extradition country. I tracked his phone. He had made a mistake. He turned it on for 3 seconds, likely to check the news. The signal pinged from a hotel near the airport. I drove there. The neon sign of the Starlight Motel buzzed with a dying electrical hum. Room 12. I kicked the door. It flew open. Julian was packing a suitcase. He looked up, his face identical to the dead man's, but alive, flushed with panic. It's over, Julian, I said. He lunged for the nightstand. I saw the glint of a gun. What would you have done in my place? Shoot. Or wait. I didn't shoot. I sidestepped. He crashed into the wall. I pinned him down. He wasn't a fighter. He was an architect. A builder of false realities. He was sick anyway. Julian screamed, his face pressed against the carpet. He was dying. I just gave him a purpose. You froze him to death, I said, cuffing him. You let him freeze in a box so you could preserve the time of death. That was the key. Freezing the body messed up the coroner's estimate of when he died. It allowed Julian to be seen on camera after Marcus was already dead, establishing an impossible alibi. But there was still one thing bothering me. The water. Why was Marcus wet? We brought Julian in. The confession spilled out of him like dirty water. He had found Marcus living on the streets near the docks. Marcus was terminally ill, desperate. Julian promised that if Marcus died in his place, the insurance money would go to Marcus's estranged daughter. A final act of redemption. Marcus agreed. He allowed himself to be sedated. But Julian was cruel. He didn't just sedate him. He put him in the industrial freezer in apartment 4A, while he was still barely breathing. The plan was to move the body to 4 billion after Julian established his alibi on the video. He would dress Marcus in his clothes, slide the chain lock with the fishing line, and leave. But why the water? I asked him in the interview room. Why was the coat soaked? Julian looked down at his hands. The freezer in 4A. It malfunctioned. It stopped working for 2 hours while I was at the jazz club. The ice started to melt. When I came back to move him, he was sitting in a pool of saltwater ice melt. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow. I didn't have a dry coat to put on him. I only had the one I was wearing, and the one he was wearing. So I dragged him in there, wet. I thought you'd think he walked in the rain. But it hadn't rained in weeks, I said softly. I know, Julian whispered. I was praying for rain. I watched the forecast every day. It said storm. The storm was supposed to hit that night. He laughed, a dry, cracking sound. The rain started 2 hours after you found him. If I had waited just 2 more hours, you never would have looked twice at the water. It was the weather that caught him. Nature itself refused to participate in his lie. Julian went to prison for life. Marcus' daughter never got the insurance money, but she got the truth. Maybe that's worth something. I retired a few years later. I still think about that room. The silence. The impossible water on the floor. It taught me that no matter how perfectly you build a lie, reality has a way of leaking in. You can lock the door, seal the window, and freeze time itself, but you can't control the sky. I walked out of the precinct that night into the pouring rain. The air was clean, finally washing away the heat and the dust. I stood there for a long time, just letting the water hit my face, grateful for something that was simple, real, and cold. And what's the strangest case you ever heard of? I'd like to read your stories in the comments.